Imagine stepping into the glittering halls of a Tudor palace, where every note played, every song sung, is more than mere melody. It is a carefully woven thread in the fabric of power, identity, and culture. The music of the Tudor court was not just background entertainment but a dynamic force shaping how monarchs projected authority, how courtiers displayed refinement, and how the very soul of a nation was expressed. From the grand ceremonial anthems echoing through chapels to the intimate lute songs performed in candlelit chambers, this soundscape of power and grace reveals a world where music was both a language and a symbol, carrying the weight of politics, religion, and personal ambition. Delving into this vibrant musical culture opens a window onto the Tudor era itself, illuminating the rhythms of a society in flux and the enduring legacy of its artistic brilliance. The Tudor era, spanning from the ascension of Henry VII in 1485 to the death of Elizabeth I in 1603, marked a significant and transformative period in English history. During these years, England emerged from the turmoil of the Wars of the Roses into a time of relative political stability, dynastic consolidation, and cultural flourishing. Among the many expressions of this vibrant cultural atmosphere, music held a unique and vital place. The music of the Tudor court was not merely entertainment. It was a powerful language through which power was projected, loyalty was expressed, divine favor was claimed, and social order was affirmed. This video explores the role of music in the Tudor court, considering how it operated both as an artistic expression and as a political, religious, and social tool. The central purpose of this inquiry is to understand the ways in which music at the Tudor court functioned within and reflected the larger currents of Tudor society. It examines how music was used by monarchs and courtiers to assert authority, craft identities, and reinforce hierarchical structures. In doing so, the study sheds light on the dual nature of music in this context. While it was a source of aesthetic pleasure and spiritual elevation, it was also a medium of control, negotiation, and resistance. The scope of the research encompasses sacred and secular music, vocal and instrumental traditions, and formal and informal musical practices as they existed in the royal court and its satellite institutions. Music in Tudor society was embedded in every layer of cultural life, but it assumed special significance at court, where it was both omnipresent and highly curated. Monarchs such as Henry VIII and Elizabeth I were not only patrons of music but active participants in its performance and dissemination. Their musical tastes and policies influenced the development of English music profoundly, from the polyphonic complexity of the early 16th century to the more introspective, expressive styles of the Elizabethan era. The presence of music at religious services, diplomatic receptions, royal weddings, coronations, and even funerals points to its role as a kind of ceremonial glue, binding the visual, verbal, and spiritual dimensions of court life into a unified performance of power and grace. This study treats music as a mirror of the Tudor worldview, one in which divinely ordained hierarchy, ritual, and spectacle reinforced the legitimacy of monarchy and the social order. In this light, court music was far from a neutral art form. The chapel royal was not simply a body of trained singers and composers. It was a political instrument, used to manifest the monarch's piety, authority, and cultural refinement. The shift from Latin to English in religious music under Edward VI was not only a theological shift but a musical one, and the later reintroduction of Catholic liturgical music under Mary I and its cautious coexistence under Elizabeth I reveal the deep entwinement of sound and faith. Music thus operated at the intersection of spiritual belief and political expediency, serving at times as a medium of reform, at others as a defense of tradition. To engage with such a multifaceted subject requires an interdisciplinary approach, drawing upon history, musicology, theology, and cultural studies. This study adopts a historical perspective by situating musical developments within the political and religious upheavals of the Tudor period. Events such as the English Reformation, the dissolution of the monasteries, the Marian Restoration, and the Elizabethan settlement were not merely abstract policy shifts. They had direct consequences for what music was heard, who performed it, and under what circumstances. Archival materials such as court records, letters, payment rolls, and printed music provide essential clues to reconstructing this sonic landscape. From a musicological standpoint, the study delves into compositional styles, forms, notation systems, and performance practices of the period. Composers like Thomas Tallis, William Byrd, and John Dowland are analyzed not simply as individual geniuses but as figures whose output was shaped by courtly expectations, religious restrictions, and patronage networks. The structural features of Tudor music, its use of imitation, modal harmony, and text setting, are studied in relation to the liturgical functions and secular tastes of the time. Moreover, instruments and ensembles, such as viol consorts, lutes and virginals, are examined for their role in shaping the court soundscape and for what their use reveals about gender, class, and intimacy in performance. Culturally, this study reads Tudor court music as a form of symbolic communication, not unlike painting, architecture, or drama. Music participated in the semiotics of power. It was used to elevate the monarch, evoke emotions, frame rituals, and entertain, all while conveying messages about order, virtue, and divine sanction. The construction of royal identity, particularly that of Elizabeth I as the Virgin Queen, was bolstered by carefully curated musical performances that emphasized chastity, majesty, and learnedness. In this way, music was not only consumed at court, it was performed by and upon the bodies of its participants, shaping how subjects viewed their ruler and their place in the kingdom. Thus, this exploration is not limited to the sounds themselves but extends to the environments in which those sounds were made and heard. The physical spaces of court performance, chapels, great halls, private chambers, each shaped the acoustic experience and contributed to the symbolic meaning of the music. The presence of foreign musicians and musical styles at court also points to the Tudor court as a cosmopolitan site of cultural exchange, where music functioned as both an aesthetic practice and a diplomatic currency. The study of music in the Tudor court offers more than a glimpse into the artistic life of a historical elite. It opens a window onto the complex interplay between power, piety, culture, and identity. Through a detailed and interdisciplinary analysis, this work seeks to reconstruct the Tudor court as a living soundscape, one where music not only graced the ears of monarchs but echoed the structures and ideologies that defined an age. The Tudor dynasty, ruling England from 1485 to 1603, emerged from the aftermath of the Wars of the Roses, a series of dynastic civil wars that left the English crown unstable and fiercely contested. With the victory of Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth Field, the stage was set for the establishment of a new royal lineage that would not only assert political control but also reshape English cultural and religious life in profound ways. The Tudor monarchs, Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, governed through a time of immense transformation, including the centralization of royal power, the Reformation, the growth of state bureaucracy, and the expansion of international diplomacy. Music was not merely a backdrop to these changes, but an essential instrument in the articulation and exercise of royal authority. It served as a performative medium of power, reinforcing the legitimacy of the Tudors and communicating their aspirations to both domestic audiences and foreign courts. Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty, was a cautious and pragmatic ruler who came to the throne with a tenuous claim. His reign was primarily focused on solidifying dynastic legitimacy and political stability after decades of civil war. While he is not remembered as a great cultural patron compared to his descendants, Henry VII understood the value of spectacle and symbolism in asserting his kingship. Music played a ceremonial role in key royal events such as coronations, weddings, and diplomatic receptions, helping to project an image of orderly governance and divine sanction. The king's establishment of a more centralized royal court and his careful orchestration of public rituals laid the groundwork for music to become more institutionalized as a component of political theater. It was under Henry VIII, however, that court culture, and with it court music, truly flourished. Henry VIII, a charismatic and cultured ruler, was a musician himself and placed immense value on artistic display as a tool of kingship. He surrounded himself with skilled performers, composers, and instrument makers, many of whom were imported from continental Europe. The music performed at his court served a dual function. It both entertained and affirmed the monarch's power and refinement. The king's direct involvement in music, he played several instruments, sang, danced, and even composed, gave an impression of personal cultivation and divine favor. His reign coincided with the influence of Renaissance humanism in England, which further elevated the role of music and learning as marks of noble character and wise rule. Henry VIII's court became a stage where music was intricately woven into political messaging. Musical pageants and masques celebrated the Tudor lineage, idealized the monarch, and often carried allegorical messages that reinforced royal ideology. Furthermore, as Henry increasingly distanced himself from Rome and asserted religious independence with the formation of the Church of England, music was employed to navigate and display this seismic shift in national identity. Composers in the royal chapel and elsewhere were tasked with adapting the liturgical music to fit new theological frameworks. The shift from Latin polyphony to English anthems and metrical psalms was not just a stylistic change but a clear political statement, underscoring the break from papal authority and the assertion of royal supremacy over the Church. Henry VIII's successors, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, continued to use music as an instrument of statecraft, though each did so in ways reflective of their religious and political priorities. Edward VI, a devout Protestant, promoted a more austere religious music that matched the reformist tone of his reign. Under his rule, traditional Latin music was curtailed in favor of English settings that emphasized textual clarity and congregational participation. This shift illustrated a move away from the elaborate musical forms associated with Catholic worship toward a style that aligned with Reformed theology and sought to instruct and unify the faithful under the monarch's spiritual leadership. Mary I, Edward's Catholic half-sister, reversed many of these reforms during her short reign. A devoted Catholic who sought to restore the old faith, Mary reinstated Latin polyphony and revived the ceremonial grandeur associated with Catholic liturgy. Her court welcomed foreign musicians and composers, particularly from Spain and the Low Countries, as part of her effort to realign England with traditional European Catholic powers. These musical choices were inseparable from her political agenda. The revival of Catholic music was meant not only to honor her personal convictions but to signal a reorientation of national policy, especially in light of her politically significant marriage to Philip II of Spain. When Elizabeth I assumed the throne in 1558, she inherited a deeply divided religious and political landscape. Her reign, lasting 45 years, was marked by a careful balancing act, positioning herself as both a Protestant monarch and a ruler who valued continuity, order, and tradition. Music was crucial in constructing and maintaining her public image. Though officially Protestant, Elizabeth allowed a certain degree of liturgical compromise in music, permitting more elaborate settings of the English service and even retaining Latin motets for private use or ceremonial occasions. This duality reflected her broader political strategy, to present the monarchy as a source of unity in a time of discord. Elizabeth's court became a locus of musical excellence and innovation, producing some of England's greatest composers, including William Byrd, Thomas Tallis, John Dowland, and Orlando Gibbons. Byrd's situation is especially illustrative of the ways music could operate as a medium of complex political messaging. As a known Catholic in Protestant England, Byrd enjoyed exceptional protection under Elizabeth's patronage. His sacred music, much of it written for clandestine Catholic worship, was also laden with political nuance, expressing dissent and loyalty simultaneously. Music, in this context, functioned not merely as worship but as a coded language of political identity, resistance, and allegiance. Throughout the Tudor period, patronage was one of the most significant mechanisms by which music acquired political significance. Patronage was not passive financial support. It was an exchange system that reinforced the authority of the patron while obligating the recipient to produce works that affirmed the benefactor's prestige and values. Royal and noble patrons used music as a form of soft power to project their refinement, influence, and proximity to the monarch. Composers and musicians, in turn, navigated a complex court culture where their survival and success depended on their ability to please and flatter powerful patrons. This relationship between patronage and propaganda is especially evident in the production of court masques, pageants, and anthems, which were often commissioned for specific occasions such as coronations, royal births, victories in battle, or diplomatic visits. These events were choreographed to impress both domestic audiences and foreign dignitaries. Music accompanied processions, highlighted rituals, and elevated the grandeur of the monarch. For visiting ambassadors, the richness of English court music served as a signal of national sophistication, wealth, and political stability. The court's investment in foreign musicians, instruments, and styles also functioned diplomatically, forging cultural ties with European powers and asserting England's place in the Renaissance world. Music, therefore, served as a vital tool in the formation of national identity. Under Henry VIII, English composers were encouraged to develop distinct stylistic signatures that could rival those of France or Italy, while still grounded in native tradition. Elizabeth I's reign especially saw the cultivation of a uniquely English musical voice, expressive, refined, and imbued with patriotic themes. Composers like Byrd and Dowland, while influenced by European styles, contributed to the emergence of an English school of composition that would lay the groundwork for the Baroque innovations of the 17th century. In the context of European diplomacy, music operated as a form of cultural exchange and soft negotiation. Royal courts across Europe often communicated through music, sending musicians and compositions as gifts or tokens of goodwill. Marriages, such as that of Mary I to Philip II of Spain, involved musical pageantry that symbolized the union of nations. Diplomats often remarked on the musical accomplishments of the English court, which were interpreted as indicators of civil order, artistic wealth, and intellectual leadership. The historical and political context of the Tudor court cannot be understood in isolation from its musical practices. Music was an essential component of Tudor statecraft, woven into the rituals of governance, the aesthetics of rule, and the performance of national identity. From the cautious consolidations of Henry VII to the elaborate musical diplomacy of Elizabeth I, each monarch used music to navigate the shifting terrain of power, faith, and international relations. Far from being a mere embellishment of royal life, music was a central medium through which the Tudor dynasty asserted its legitimacy, communicated its values, and staged its presence on the world stage. When Henry VII ascended to the English throne in 1485 after his victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field, he was inheriting a kingdom fractured by decades of civil conflict. The Wars of the Roses had not only devastated the English nobility but had also disrupted many of the royal institutions that had once upheld the cultural fabric of the monarchy, including music. Henry VII's reign was therefore as much about political consolidation as it was about cultural restoration. One of the early tasks of his administration was to re-establish the stability and ceremonial grandeur of the court, which included reviving and reorganizing its musical life. Though Henry VII was not as overtly flamboyant or musically inclined as his son would later be, his reign laid the critical groundwork for the rich musical traditions that would flourish under the Tudors. In seeking to restore the prestige of the monarchy, Henry recognized the symbolic power of ceremony and ritual. Music played a central role in the staging of this authority. The re-establishment of institutions like the Chapel Royal, England's foremost ecclesiastical musical body, was key to this endeavor. The Chapel Royal served as the sonic heart of the court's religious life, providing music for daily services and special liturgical events. Henry VII invested in the chapel by appointing skilled musicians and composers and ensuring the return of structured, high-quality performances. Though records from this period are less complete than those from later Tudor reigns, surviving documents indicate that the king maintained a well-staffed musical household, including singers, players of wind and string instruments, and composers. The court music of Henry VII's reign bore the influence of several traditions, combining older English practices with styles from continental Europe. One of the most significant external influences came from the Burgundian court, which during the 15th century had developed a highly sophisticated musical culture. Burgundy's polyphonic style, marked by its elegant melodic lines and harmonic richness, had a profound impact on courts across Europe. Henry VII, who spent much of his early life in exile in Brittany and France, was likely exposed to these styles and brought elements of them back to England upon his return. This continental influence was evident in both sacred and secular music at the Tudor court. In sacred music, composers began to experiment with more complex vocal textures and contrapuntal techniques, inspired by the practices of Franco-Flemish composers like Guillaume Dufay and Johannes Ockeghem. While much of the early English polyphony of this period remains anonymous or fragmentary, the stylistic fingerprints of continental Europe are clear. These sacred compositions were primarily performed by the Chapel Royal and served both religious and ceremonial purposes, reinforcing the divine right of the monarch and adding splendor to liturgical celebrations. At the same time, there was a resurgence of native English musical traditions. English composers, while adopting some continental forms, maintained a distinct character in their music, especially in their use of melodic clarity and structural balance. This blend of foreign and domestic influences created a uniquely English sound that would continue to evolve under later Tudor monarchs. Secular music, too, reflected this hybrid identity. Songs and instrumental pieces were performed in more intimate court settings, often accompanying feasts, dances, and courtly entertainments. Many of these pieces drew on English folk melodies and poetic forms, preserving a native musical language that resonated with the traditions of earlier medieval England. Instrumental music began to gain more prominence during Henry VII's reign, with records indicating the employment of players of the lute, harp, rebec, sackbut, and shawm. These musicians were essential to the life of the court, providing accompaniment for dances, processions, and public entertainments. The inclusion of both foreign and English musicians in the king's service suggests that Henry VII was conscious of the political symbolism of music, its ability to project refinement, wealth, and cosmopolitanism. The presence of foreign musicians also functioned as a form of diplomatic outreach, signaling alliances and cultural exchange between England and other European powers. Despite the relatively limited documentation of individual composers under Henry VII compared to later periods, the broader musical infrastructure of the court was clearly being rebuilt. The king's investment in religious and secular music was part of a larger campaign to assert the legitimacy and continuity of his rule. Music accompanied major state occasions such as the coronation, royal weddings, and diplomatic receptions. These performances were not merely decorative, they were orchestrated statements of order, power, and dynastic stability. The Royal Progress, a traveling court designed to showcase the monarch throughout the realm, often included musical performances that reinforced royal authority and brought the sound of the court into the lives of common subjects. The use of music in religious life was also tightly intertwined with the political aims of the monarchy. In an era when public worship was inseparable from state ideology, the sound of the chapel royal resonating through Westminster Abbey or other major cathedrals was a sensory affirmation of divine favor and national unity. Through carefully crafted liturgical music, the monarchy presented itself as the protector of the true faith and the conduit between heaven and earth. Even before the upheavals of the Reformation, music was already performing a theological function that reinforced the sacred nature of kingship. It is also worth noting that Henry VII's musical patronage extended beyond the court. As part of his broader consolidation of power, he encouraged cultural and religious institutions throughout the realm to return to stability and productivity. This included cathedrals, collegiate churches, and noble households that maintained their own choirs and chapels. By supporting the wider musical ecosystem of the country, the monarchy ensured that a broader base of musical literacy and creativity would be available to serve the crown. In essence, the music of Henry VII's court was both a reflection and an instrument of his political agenda. It was carefully curated to support the narrative of a restored and righteous monarchy, one that was connected to both English tradition and European sophistication. Though less flamboyant than what would follow under Henry VIII or Elizabeth I, this early period of Tudor music laid the foundations for what would become one of the richest and most artistically significant phases in English musical history. Music during Henry VII's reign was not only a vehicle of royal magnificence but also a tool for healing a divided kingdom, drawing on the past while quietly anticipating the transformations to come. Henry VIII's reign is widely recognized as a golden age for English court music. Few monarchs in European history were as personally involved in music as Henry VIII, whose rule elevated the art to an unprecedented position within the cultural and political life of the royal court. Known not only for his tumultuous personal life and political transformations, most notably the English Reformation, Henry was also a passionate patron of the arts and an accomplished musician in his own right. His deep engagement with music shaped the soundscape of Tudor England and contributed significantly to the cultural flourishing of the Renaissance in the British Isles. From an early age, Henry VIII received a humanist education that emphasized the liberal arts, including music. Born the second son of Henry VII, Henry was originally intended for a career in the church, and his early instruction reflected this ecclesiastical orientation. He was taught by some of the finest tutors of the time, including the poet laureate John Skelton. In addition to Latin, theology, and rhetoric, young Henry was trained in music, which was considered an essential component of a prince's formation. He learned to sing, compose, and play several instruments, including the lute, organ, harp, flute, and virginals. These accomplishments were more than mere diversions. They were visible signs of his education, refinement, and readiness to rule. As king, Henry VIII maintained his enthusiasm for music and took an active role in shaping the court's musical culture. He composed songs and instrumental pieces, although scholarly consensus suggests that the works attributed to him, such as the famous Pastime with Good Company, may have been collaborative efforts or at least influenced by court composers. Regardless of authorship, these pieces reflect the courtly values of pleasure, chivalry, and social harmony. Music was part of the king's personal identity, and he performed publicly, particularly in masques and informal gatherings. His musical skill was celebrated by contemporary observers, both domestic and foreign, who regarded him as a model of the Renaissance prince, vigorous in war, learned in letters, and accomplished in the arts. Henry VIII's court was populated with an extensive and talented array of musicians, organized into various ensembles that reflected the complexity and ceremonial richness of court life. At the heart of this system was the Chapel Royal, the premier musical institution of the kingdom. The Chapel Royal consisted of priests, boy choristers, and adult male singers who provided music for daily religious services, royal events, and state ceremonies. Its members were highly trained, often recruited from leading cathedral choirs and collegiate institutions. The chapel served not only a liturgical function but also a political one. Its music signaled the majesty and sacred authority of the monarch. In addition to the Chapel Royal, Henry maintained a large household of secular musicians, including minstrels, instrumentalists, and court singers. These performers were employed to provide entertainment at feasts, balls, and private gatherings. Instruments such as viols, lutes, recorders, sackbuts, and shawms were common, and consort music, ensemble playing, became increasingly sophisticated. The court's musical resources were not static. They expanded over time to accommodate new tastes, styles, and ceremonial needs. The organization of court musicians was hierarchical, with a master of the king's music overseeing the overall program, and various subordinates managing specific ensembles. Music was woven into the daily rhythms of court life. It accompanied the liturgy, marked the passage of the day, and elevated the ambience of banquets and leisure hours. Special occasions, such as royal weddings, diplomatic visits, and military victories, were celebrated with elaborate musical performances, often involving collaborations between composers, poets, and theatrical designers. These spectacles were more than entertainment. They were instruments of royal propaganda, affirming the monarch's power, divine favor, and cultural sophistication. Through music, the court projected a vision of harmonious order that mirrored the political stability the king claimed to offer. Henry VIII's patronage of music was deeply influenced by Renaissance humanism, a movement that emphasized the study and emulation of classical antiquity and valued the cultivation of individual talent and intellect. Under this influence, music was increasingly seen not only as a craft or service but as a learned art worthy of scholarly attention and artistic refinement. Composers were elevated to the status of intellectuals, and musical skill was regarded as a sign of moral and aesthetic virtue. This intellectual climate encouraged the production of more ambitious, textually expressive, and structurally complex compositions. The king's embrace of humanism was also reflected in his openness to musical exchange with the European continent. Henry VIII invited numerous foreign musicians to his court, particularly from Italy, France, and the Low Countries, which were then at the forefront of musical innovation. These musicians brought with them new styles, techniques, and repertories, enriching the musical landscape of England. The exchange was not one-sided. English musicians and composers also traveled abroad and participated in pan-European artistic dialogues. This internationalism was part of Henry's broader diplomatic strategy, which sought to place England on equal footing with the major powers of Europe by demonstrating cultural as well as political sophistication. Among the many composers and musicians who served at Henry's court, several stand out. Robert Fairfax, one of the leading English composers of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, was active during the early years of Henry's reign and was known for his sophisticated polyphonic masses and votive antiphons. Fairfax's style bridged the medieval and Renaissance worlds, blending complex counterpoint with a growing sensitivity to textual expression. John Taverner, another prominent figure, composed large-scale liturgical works that embodied the grandeur and devotional intensity of pre-Reformation sacred music. Taverner's compositions, such as the Missa Gloria, exemplify the elaborate and expressive sacred polyphony that flourished before the religious upheavals of the 1530s. Sacred music formed a central pillar of the court repertoire, particularly in the early and middle parts of Henry's reign. Mass settings, motets, and hymns were composed for the major feasts of the Christian calendar and for special royal occasions. These works often featured rich polyphonic textures, expansive melodic lines, and a deep sense of spiritual reverence. Latin remained the dominant liturgical language until the onset of the Reformation, after which English began to be introduced, though more slowly and cautiously than under later monarchs. Even as theological shifts began to influence the content and form of sacred music, Henry retained a love for the grandeur of the Catholic musical tradition, maintaining the Chapel Royal and its Latin services for much of his reign. Alongside sacred music, secular genres flourished, particularly in the form of songs, dances, and instrumental consort music. Secular songs were often composed for voice and lute, exploring themes of love, nature, and courtly life. These works were sometimes performed in intimate settings and reflected the aesthetic ideals of courtly refinement and emotional nuance. Lute songs, in particular, enjoyed considerable popularity and would later become a hallmark of Elizabethan music. Dance music was another significant aspect of court entertainment. The Tudor court delighted in pageantry, and dancing was both a social activity and a performance art. Dances such as the pavane, galliard, and Almain were accompanied by lively instrumental ensembles. These dances were often choreographed for court masques, elaborate performances that combined music, poetry, costume, and allegory. Such events were more than diversions. They communicated political messages, reinforced court hierarchies, and celebrated dynastic continuity. Instrumental music expanded in both scope and complexity during Henry's reign. The emergence of consort music, ensembles of like or mixed instruments playing polyphonic compositions, represented a major innovation. These consorts performed arrangements of vocal works as well as original instrumental pieces, contributing to the development of abstract musical forms independent of text. This growing interest in instrumental music laid the groundwork for the later flourishing of the English viol consort in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Henry VIII's reign also saw the compilation and preservation of important musical manuscripts, which offer insight into the court repertoire and performance practices of the time. The Henry VIII manuscript, for example, contains over 100 compositions, many of which are secular songs attributed to the king and his contemporaries. This collection not only documents the musical tastes of the court but also illustrates the diversity of styles, ranging from simple strophic songs to more complex part music for voices and instruments. The Reformation introduced a period of tension and transformation in English court music. While Henry broke from Rome and established himself as supreme head of the Church of England, he did not immediately adopt the radical liturgical reforms embraced by some of his Protestant advisers. Instead, he pursued a middle path that preserved many elements of Catholic ritual and music, at least publicly. This cautious approach allowed for the continued performance of Latin polyphony even as theological changes unfolded. The musical culture of the court thus remained largely intact through the 1540s, though composers and musicians increasingly found themselves navigating uncertain religious and political terrain. The reign of Henry VIII represents a peak in the development of English court music. His personal passion for music, combined with his patronage of talented composers and performers, transformed the Tudor court into one of Europe's leading cultural centers. Music under Henry was a multifaceted expression of power, identity, and artistic ambition. It was both an ornament of kingship and an active agent of statecraft. The court's musical institutions, its international exchanges, and its rich repertory of sacred and secular works set a standard that would influence English music for generations. As a musical monarch, Henry VIII left a legacy that extended far beyond his compositions, shaping the sound of a dynasty and the cultural imagination of a nation. The mid-Tudor period, encompassing the reigns of Edward VI and Mary I, marked a time of profound upheaval and transformation in English music, particularly within the sacred sphere. Following the death of Henry VIII in 1547, his son Edward VI ascended the throne at the tender age of 9. Though too young to rule independently, Edward's reign was dominated by powerful Protestant regents, most notably Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and later John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. These guardians carried forward the Protestant Reformation in England with increasing zeal, resulting in dramatic changes to religious practice, theology, and, crucially, to church music. The Protestant vision of religious worship, as implemented during Edward VI's reign, diverged sharply from the ornate Catholic traditions that had long defined English sacred music. Central to this shift was the reimagining of the liturgy in both form and content. Under the guidance of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, new liturgical texts were crafted in English, replacing the Latin rites that had governed worship for centuries. Cranmer's 1549 Book of Common Prayer, and the more radical 1552 version that followed, formed the backbone of the English Reformation's theological and ceremonial outlook. These texts promoted simplicity, clarity, and congregational understanding, principles that had significant consequences for music. Whereas Latin polyphony had once flourished, characterized by complex interweaving vocal lines and lengthy, richly textured settings of the Mass and liturgical offices, the New English services called for a more restrained musical language. The emphasis on the intelligibility of the text led to a preference for syllabic settings, homophonic textures, and shorter forms. The elaborate melismas and extended musical structures of the Catholic tradition were now seen as incompatible with the spiritual clarity and moral austerity that Protestant reformers sought to instill. Composers of the period, many of whom had served under Henry VIII, were forced to adapt swiftly to these changing circumstances. One of the most significant figures to navigate this transition was Thomas Tallis, whose career spanned the reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. Under Edward's rule, Tallis composed music that conformed to the new English liturgical norms, producing settings of metrical psalms, English responses, and simple anthem forms. His work during this time, while less flamboyant than his earlier Latin motets, nonetheless demonstrates a careful balancing act between musical elegance and doctrinal obedience. Another notable composer of the Edwardian period was John Shepherd, who also adapted to the new demands of Protestant worship. His English settings, such as the responsory "I Give You a New Commandment," exhibit clarity and textual emphasis, while still retaining a degree of polyphonic richness. Yet both Shepherd and Tallis, like many musicians of the time, must have experienced a sense of loss as centuries of musical tradition were rapidly dismantled in favor of a new order that was still finding its artistic footing. The destruction of monastic institutions under Henry VIII and the subsequent iconoclasm during Edward's reign devastated many musical establishments. Choir schools, religious houses, and collegiate churches, once hubs of musical training and performance, were closed, repurposed, or stripped of their resources. Organs were dismantled, choir books burned, and valuable manuscripts lost. The dissolution of these institutions meant not only the loss of repertory and performance spaces, but also the disruption of the musical education system that had nurtured generations of composers and singers. At court, the changes were equally striking. While Henry VIII had presided over a court renowned for its musical opulence, Edward's court embraced a more subdued aesthetic. This was partly a reflection of his youth and the dominance of his Protestant advisors, but it also mirrored the theological belief that music should support the worship of God through clarity, sincerity, and modesty. Elaborate ceremonial music gave way to simpler forms, and Latin motets and masses disappeared from court services. The chapel royal, though still functioning, was reduced in scope and ambition. Even so, it remained a key center for the development of English-language church music. The tide of reform was abruptly reversed in 1553, when Edward died unexpectedly at the age of 15 and his half-sister Mary I succeeded him. The daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, Mary was a devout Catholic and committed to reversing the Protestant changes that had taken root during her brother's reign. Her accession marked not only a political and theological shift but also a cultural and musical restoration. The Latin Rite was reintroduced, and with it, the rich traditions of Catholic sacred music. Mary's restoration of Catholicism was not simply a nostalgic return to past practices, It was an urgent campaign to reassert a unified religious identity through the familiar structures and sensory experiences of pre-Reformation worship. Music was a key part of this project. The Latin Mass and the traditional offices were reinstated at court and in the chapel royal. The change in musical style was immediate and pronounced. Elaborate polyphony returned, organs were repaired or replaced, and choirs were reconstituted. Mary's marriage to Philip II of Spain in 1554 had significant musical and cultural implications. It brought a wave of Spanish and Flemish influence to the English court, as musicians and composers from the Habsburg realms accompanied the royal consort. This influx introduced new stylistic features to English church music, including a more austere and somber tone, as well as a heightened focus on devotional intensity. The music of the Spanish court, particularly its austere polyphony rooted in the style of composers like Cristobal de Morales and the early works of Tomás Luis de Victoria, resonated with Mary's personal piety and her desire to reinforce Catholic orthodoxy. At the same time, Mary also looked to England's own musical past as a source of continuity and legitimacy. Composers such as Tallis and Shepherd were once again encouraged to write in Latin, producing some of their most profound and expressive works during this period. Tallis's Missa Pura, possibly composed for a Christmas celebration in honor of Mary's hoped-for heir, is a prime example of the grandeur and devotional richness that characterized Marian church music. This six-voice mass setting, likely intended for the chapel royal, evokes the sound world of late medieval English polyphony while also incorporating the more controlled and contemplative spirit of continental Catholic music. Shepherd, too, produced some of his most enduring Latin works during Mary's reign, including the antiphon Media Vita and the Second Service. These compositions are marked by dense textures, expansive phrases, and a palpable sense of solemnity, reflecting the gravity of the religious climate and the high ceremonial standards of the restored Catholic liturgy. Their emotional depth and structural sophistication suggest a reawakening of creative possibilities that had been constrained under Edward's reforms. While Mary's religious policies were deeply unpopular with many of her subjects, especially her persecution of Protestants, which earned her the epithet Bloody Mary, her support for sacred music and the restoration of ecclesiastical institutions temporarily rejuvenated the artistic life of the Church. Cathedral and collegiate choirs were revived, and efforts were made to recover and restore lost or damaged musical manuscripts. The sense of continuity with the pre-Reformation past offered a powerful reassurance to many Catholics, even as the political situation remained precarious. Court life under Mary, though more somber than under her father, still provided space for musical activity. Religious festivals, royal progresses, and diplomatic ceremonies were accompanied by formal musical performances. The court's musicians, including many of the same singers and composers who had served under Edward, adapted once again to the shifting theological winds. This fluidity speaks not only to their technical versatility but also to their resilience in an era of extreme volatility. Despite these efforts, the Marian musical revival was short-lived. Mary's death in 1558, and the succession of her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth I, marked the end of Catholic dominance in England. Much of the music composed or restored during Mary's reign would soon fall out of favor or be suppressed. Nonetheless, this brief period left a lasting imprint on the English musical tradition. The revival of Latin polyphony, the incorporation of continental styles, and the deepening of devotional expressiveness enriched the sacred repertoire in ways that would influence later composers, including William Byrd and Orlando Gibbons. The mid-Tudor musical landscape, therefore, was one of both rupture and continuity. Under Edward VI, the Protestant Reformation catalyzed a dramatic rethinking of the purpose and form of sacred music, emphasizing clarity, textual intelligibility, and congregational participation. This resulted in new genres such as the English anthem and service, and forced composers to reconsider their aesthetic priorities. Under Mary I, a conscious restoration of Catholic tradition led to a resurgence of Latin polyphony, ceremonial splendor, and musical expression rooted in older devotional forms, but shaped by new international currents. These oscillations between reform and restoration were not merely artistic shifts. They reflected the larger struggle for England's religious soul and national identity. Music, as both a cultural product and a medium of worship, became a battleground where theological ideas, political ideologies, and artistic values collided and coalesced. The composers who lived through this era had to respond to rapid changes in liturgical structure, patronage, and audience expectation, often within the span of a few years. What emerged from this turbulent period was a more diversified and adaptive musical tradition, one that could embrace both the austere clarity of Protestant worship and the ornate richness of Catholic ceremony. The legacy of Edward VI and Mary I, though marked by opposition, is ultimately complementary in the broader arc of English musical history. Their reigns tested the limits of musical form and function, prompting both innovation and reflection, and setting the stage for the remarkable synthesis of styles and ideas that would define the Elizabethan musical renaissance. Queen Elizabeth I's reign, 1558 to 1603, marked a golden era for English music, intertwining artistic innovation with political strategy. Music became a powerful tool for projecting royal authority, shaping national identity, and navigating the complex religious and political landscape of the time. Elizabeth herself was a skilled musician, proficient in playing the lute and virginals, and possessed a fine singing voice. Her personal engagement with music elevated its status at court, making it an essential aspect of daily life and statecraft. Music was employed to craft the image of Elizabeth as the Virgin Queen, a symbol of purity and divine right, reinforcing her legitimacy and the stability of her reign. This image was meticulously constructed through court entertainments, portraits, and public ceremonies, where music played a central role in conveying messages of power and continuity. The court attracted some of the most talented composers of the era, including William Byrd, Thomas Tallis, and John Dowland. Byrd and Tallis, both Catholics in a Protestant court, navigated their religious affiliations carefully. In 1575, Elizabeth granted them an exclusive 21-year monopoly to print and publish music, a significant privilege that underscored their importance to the crown. Their publication, Canciones Sacrae, featured Latin motets that, while sacred, were politically neutral enough to be acceptable in the Anglican context. John Dowland, renowned for his melancholic lute songs, also served in Elizabeth's court. His compositions, such as Flow My Tears, captured the era's complex emotional landscape and were emblematic of the English Renaissance's artistic achievements. Dowland's music, while secular, often carried subtle political undertones, reflecting the intricate interplay between art and governance. Music was integral to court ceremonies and public spectacles. During royal progresses, elaborate entertainments were staged, featuring masks, dances, and musical performances designed to impress and convey political messages. These events allowed Elizabeth to display her magnificence and reinforce her connection with her subjects. Masks, in particular, were elaborate productions combining music, dance, and drama, often allegorically representing the Queen's virtues and the harmony of her realm. The Chapel Royal served as the epicenter of sacred music, with composers like Byrd and Tallis contributing to its rich repertoire. Despite the Protestant Reformation's emphasis on vernacular worship, Latin compositions remained prevalent in the chapel, reflecting a nuanced religious policy that balanced tradition with reform. Elizabeth's patronage extended beyond the court, influencing the broader musical landscape of England. Her support for music printing and publication facilitated the dissemination of English compositions, fostering a national musical identity. This era saw the flourishing of the English madrigal, a secular vocal music form that became immensely popular and contributed to the cultural vibrancy of the period. In summary, music under Elizabeth I was not merely entertainment but a vital instrument of statecraft. It served to construct and project the Queen's image, navigate religious complexities, and cultivate a sense of national identity. The legacy of Elizabethan music, characterized by its artistic excellence and political astuteness, continues to resonate as a defining feature of the English Renaissance. The English Reformation, initiated under Henry VIII and intensified during the reigns of his children, brought profound changes to sacred music, which had previously thrived under a centuries-old Catholic tradition. The movement from Latin to English in church services, driven by both theological necessity and political ideology, radically reshaped the role, form, and function of music in worship. This transformation required composers to rethink not only their musical styles but also their relationship with state authority. At the heart of this complex evolution were figures like William Byrd and Thomas Tallis, whose careers reveal the delicate balance between artistic expression, religious belief, and political obedience in a time of spiritual upheaval. One of the most visible and disruptive effects of the Reformation was the transition from Latin to English in church services. This was not merely a linguistic change but a doctrinal statement. Protestant reformers emphasized the need for worship in the vernacular so that congregants could understand and internalize the teachings of Scripture. This emphasis on textual clarity and direct engagement with the Word of God meant that the florid polyphony of medieval Latin liturgical music was no longer appropriate. Instead, a new style emerged, characterized by syllabic text settings, clear homophony, and shorter forms, all designed to prioritize comprehensibility over musical complexity. Composers who had developed their craft within the richly ornamented traditions of Latin liturgy were faced with a new and challenging musical environment. Thomas Tallis, one of the most senior and adaptable composers of the period, responded with remarkable versatility. While he had written elaborate Latin motets and masses earlier in his career, he adjusted his compositional voice to accommodate the stylistic demands of the new Anglican Church. His English-language anthems, such as If Ye Love Me, exemplify the Protestant aesthetic, direct, restrained, and focused on the intelligibility of the text. Yet Tallis never entirely abandoned Latin. During periods of political and religious fluctuation, he composed in both languages, navigating a complex landscape where orthodoxy could shift swiftly with each monarch. William Byrd, Tallis's younger contemporary and sometime collaborator, presents a more complicated case. A committed Catholic living under Protestant rule, Byrd composed extensively for the Anglican Church while also producing a large body of music for the Latin Catholic liturgy. These Latin works, often intended for private worship among recusant communities, were deeply expressive and at times defiant in tone. His Mass for 4 voices, Mass for 5 voices, and numerous Latin motets are striking in their emotional intensity, compositional sophistication, and spiritual depth. They represent both a continuation of Catholic musical heritage and a subtle act of resistance against the state-imposed religious conformity. Byrd's position was unusual and precarious. His Catholicism was known, and he was occasionally fined for his recusancy. Yet he enjoyed a level of protection and even favor from Queen Elizabeth I, which suggests a degree of royal tolerance toward artistic excellence, even when it came from politically suspect sources. This complex relationship between composer and crown highlights the dual function of sacred music in the period, as a medium of worship and as a tool of political utility. Byrd's Anglican compositions, such as the English services and anthems, demonstrate his ability to conform outwardly, while his Latin works allowed him to express his personal faith and to serve a clandestine religious community. The monarchy's involvement in church music extended well beyond personal patronage. With the establishment of the Church of England, the Crown assumed control over many aspects of religious life, including music. Licensing and censorship became important tools for regulating liturgical content and maintaining doctrinal conformity. Composers needed official approval to publish sacred music, and the text of compositions was subject to scrutiny. The 1559 Act of Uniformity, which mandated the use of the Book of Common Prayer, reinforced the state's authority over worship practices and limited liturgical diversity. One of the clearest examples of this control was the 1575 patent granted to Tallis and Byrd by Elizabeth I, giving them a 21-year monopoly on the printing of music and the ruled paper necessary for musical notation. This privilege not only underscored their importance as composers, but also functioned as a mechanism of state control. By concentrating the power to publish in the hands of 2 trusted musicians, the Crown ensured that sacred music remained within acceptable boundaries. At the same time, the patent allowed Tallis and Byrd a degree of artistic freedom and financial stability in a volatile environment. The Chapel Royal stood at the center of these musical and political developments. As the monarch's personal religious institution, it functioned both as a place of worship and as a symbol of royal authority. The chapel's music, performed by a professional choir of men and boys, reflected the theological and aesthetic shifts of the Reformation while also reinforcing the monarchy's role as the guardian of both church and nation. Composers associated with the Chapel Royal were expected to produce music that was doctrinally sound, musically sophisticated, and politically appropriate. Services in the Chapel Royal were public events, often attended by foreign diplomats and domestic elites, making them important venues for projecting religious and political messages. The music performed there had to serve a dual purpose. It needed to embody the spiritual values of the English Church while also demonstrating the cultural refinement and stability of the Elizabethan regime. Latin works were not entirely eliminated from the repertoire, especially in the more ceremonial contexts of the chapel, where their grandeur and tradition lent a sense of continuity with the pre-Reformation past. This selective retention of Latin liturgical music served to temper the iconoclasm of early reformers and helped establish a uniquely English Protestant identity that was rooted in both innovation and heritage. Despite the pressures of conformity, sacred music in this period was far from stagnant. Composers found ways to infuse their work with expressive depth and artistic integrity, even within the constraints of religious orthodoxy. The anthem, a uniquely English genre, became a rich field for experimentation. It allowed for both choral and solo textures, setting biblical texts, prayers, or devotional poetry in English. Byrd's anthems, such as Sing Joyfully, combined the clarity demanded by reformers with the contrapuntal mastery of older traditions. These works were both devotional and performative, suited to the needs of worship and the expectations of a sophisticated courtly audience. Moreover, the tension between personal belief and public obligation gave rise to music of exceptional emotional complexity. Byrd's Latin motets often carried coded messages of resistance, martyrdom, and spiritual perseverance. These motets, while liturgically unsanctioned, reached an audience of sympathizers and offered a form of consolation and communal identity. The state's attempts to regulate sacred music did not extinguish its vitality, but instead fostered a layered and often paradoxical musical culture. Public conformity was accompanied by private dissent, and the same composers who served the crown also gave voice to religious minorities. This duality was possible in part because of the high esteem in which music was held, both as an art form and as a vehicle of religious devotion. The crown understood the power of music to shape sentiment, enforce discipline, and symbolize authority, and it sought to harness this power without entirely suppressing creative individuality. As the Reformation progressed and became institutionalized under Elizabeth I, sacred music stabilized into a form that balanced tradition and innovation. The English service setting, the anthem, and the occasional Latin motet coexisted within a framework that supported Protestant doctrine while allowing room for artistic excellence. Composers like Byrd, Tallis, and later figures such as Orlando Gibbons and Thomas Tomkins continued to enrich this tradition, producing works that remain central to the English choral canon. Sacred music during the English Reformation underwent a profound transformation, shaped by liturgical reform, political necessity, and personal conviction. The shift from Latin to English worship fundamentally altered the role of music in religious life, demanding new compositional approaches and new relationships between composer, church, and state. Yet this period of disruption also gave rise to a remarkable flowering of creativity. Composers like Byrd and Tallis exemplify the resilience and adaptability of sacred music, using their craft to navigate the complexities of faith and authority. Through their works, they not only preserved the spiritual depth of earlier traditions, but also helped define a distinctly English musical identity that continues to resonate centuries later. During the Elizabethan era, secular music was an integral part of courtly life, permeating various aspects of entertainment, social interaction, and personal expression. Masques, interludes, and pageantry were prominent forms of entertainment that combined music, dance, and drama to celebrate significant events and display the grandeur of the court. These performances often featured elaborate costumes and allegorical themes, serving both as entertainment and as a means to convey political messages or royal propaganda. Feasting and revelry were also accompanied by music, enhancing the festive atmosphere and providing a backdrop for socialization among courtiers. Musicians played during banquets and celebrations, offering both background music and featured performances that showcased the talents of composers and performers alike. Such events reinforced social hierarchies and allowed the nobility to demonstrate their cultural refinement. Secular songs of the period often employed symbolism to explore themes of love, power, and morality. Allegorical content allowed composers and lyricists to comment on contemporary issues subtly, using metaphor and narrative to engage audiences intellectually and emotionally. Gender played a significant role in musical performance. with societal expectations influencing who could perform certain types of music and how they were received. Female musicians, for instance, were often associated with both enchantment and moral ambiguity, reflecting broader cultural attitudes toward women's roles in society. Instrumental music flourished during this time, with instruments like the lute, viol, virginals, and recorder gaining popularity. The lute, in particular, was favored for its versatility and expressive capacity, often accompanying solo songs or being played in consort settings. Viol consorts provided rich, polyphonic textures suitable for both courtly entertainment and private enjoyment. The virginals, a keyboard instrument similar to the harpsichord, was commonly used for solo performances and teaching music within noble households. Recorders, with their sweet tone, were employed in both ensemble and solo contexts, contributing to the diverse soundscape of the era. Performance practices of the time emphasized improvisation and personal expression, with musicians expected to embellish melodies and adapt compositions to suit the occasion. This flexibility allowed for a dynamic musical culture that valued both technical skill and creative interpretation. Music education was considered essential for the nobility, with proficiency in playing instruments and understanding musical theory seen as markers of a well-rounded individual. Secular music during the Elizabethan period was deeply woven into the fabric of courtly life, serving as a vehicle for entertainment, social cohesion, and personal expression. Through performances at masques, feasts, and private gatherings, music reflected and influenced the cultural and political milieu of the time, leaving a lasting legacy that continues to be studied and appreciated today. In Tudor England, music was a deeply embedded cultural force shaped not only by politics and religion, but also by social structures such as gender and class. Music could reflect and reinforce existing hierarchies, but it also served as a point of access or advancement for individuals across the social spectrum. For noble women, music was both a form of refinement and a medium of expression. For lower-class composers and performers, it offered the possibility, however constrained, of upward mobility. Simultaneously, the professionalization of music education and the development of theoretical frameworks during the Tudor era laid the foundation for England's distinct contribution to European music. Women at the Tudor court were both patrons and participants in music-making, with their influence shaped by their rank and roles within aristocratic society. Noble women were trained in music from an early age, with instruction in instruments such as the lute, virginals, and voice considered essential to a proper education. Music offered them a socially acceptable means of self-expression and a way to demonstrate cultural sophistication. These performances often took place in private or semi-private settings, such as family chambers or intimate court gatherings, where a noblewoman's skill could be admired without compromising propriety. Yet despite these limitations, some women gained visibility through music, especially when they served as patrons to male composers or were the subjects of musical compositions. The most influential female musical figure of the Tudor period was Queen Elizabeth I. As a monarch, Elizabeth was not only a patron of the arts but also a skilled musician in her own right, trained in singing and several instruments. Her musical knowledge and appreciation allowed her to communicate in a cultural language shared with courtiers and foreign diplomats alike. Composers and poets frequently referenced Elizabeth in their works, using the medium of music to construct and reinforce her mythic persona as the Virgin Queen. This portrayal was a political tool that combined divine imagery, moral purity, and regal authority, qualities that found symbolic expression in the allegorical masques and pageants of her reign. Outside the nobility, music provided some individuals with a rare avenue for social mobility. The Tudor period saw the rise of the gentleman musician, a figure who, while not born into nobility, achieved recognition and patronage through exceptional skill and education. Many of these musicians began their careers as choir boys or apprentices in cathedral and collegiate choirs. Institutions such as the Chapel Royal and various cathedral schools trained young boys in music, offering rigorous education in both sacred and secular repertoires. Those who excelled could become professional musicians at court or in aristocratic households. The career trajectory of William Byrd is an illustrative example. Although not of noble birth, his musical talents earned him royal favor, land grants, and a publishing monopoly. Court music was also populated by performers and composers of artisan background. These musicians, often drawn from towns or guild traditions, occupied a complicated social position. While not considered gentlemen, they were valued for their craft and often employed in households or civic ensembles. Music provided them with a livelihood and, in some cases, with limited social elevation. Their contributions to dance music, consort repertoire, and teaching were crucial to the vibrant musical culture of the Tudor court. Their work also helped bridge the divide between popular and elite musical traditions, allowing for the transmission of folk idioms into more formal compositions. Education played a pivotal role in sustaining and advancing the musical life of the Tudor court. Boys with musical promise were selected at a young age to join choir schools, such as those affiliated with St. Paul's Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, or the Chapel Royal. These institutions provided a rigorous training that combined daily liturgical singing with instruction in theory, composition, and instrumental performance. The curriculum was demanding and competitive, producing musicians capable of meeting the court's exacting standards. In addition to institutional education, private tutors played an important role in the musical formation of both male and female students, particularly within aristocratic families. Tutors were often professional musicians themselves, hired to instruct the children of noble households in keyboard, lute, viol, and voice. The intimate setting of one-on-one lessons allowed for tailored instruction, including improvisation and composition, and further entrenched music as a symbol of elite refinement. Apprenticeship was another pathway, especially for those of modest means, offering practical training under the supervision of a master musician. These apprentices often learned by copying out music, tuning instruments, or accompanying their masters in performances, gradually acquiring the skills necessary to sustain an independent career. During the Tudor period, music theory and composition became increasingly systematized. Several English writers produced treatises on music that both reflected and shaped contemporary practice. One of the most important was Thomas Morley's A Plain and Easy Introduction to Practical Music, a comprehensive manual that covered the basics of notation, counterpoint, and performance. Aimed at amateur musicians, Morley's work was also a reflection of the growing popularity of music as a domestic art. It drew on both native traditions and continental sources, particularly Italian and Franco-Flemish theorists. Morley's dialogue format, pedagogical tone, and accessible language helped make music theory more widely available beyond clerical or professional circles. Continental influence was significant in shaping Tudor compositional styles. English musicians were well aware of developments in Italy, Burgundy, and the Low Countries, and they adopted and adapted these influences to suit local tastes. For instance, the English fondness for expressive text setting and tonal clarity was shaped in part by exposure to Italian madrigals, yet the resulting English madrigal developed its own distinct character, often lighter and more narrative in tone. Similarly, while polyphonic complexity remained a valued skill, there was a concurrent shift towards simpler textures and clearer harmonic structures, particularly in the context of Protestant liturgical music. Notation systems also underwent refinement during this time. The use of mensural notation, carried over from medieval practice, continued, but composers increasingly used more standardized methods of indicating rhythm, pitch, and meter. This facilitated both the composition and dissemination of music, particularly as music printing became more common. The 1575 royal patent granted to William Byrd and Thomas Tallis gave them exclusive rights to print music in England, and their publication of Canciones Sacrae marked a turning point in English music publishing. Printed collections allowed compositions to circulate beyond the court and cathedrals, reaching a broader audience of amateur and semi-professional musicians. The combination of increased access to musical instruction, the availability of printed music, and the development of theoretical manuals helped cultivate a musically literate public. While the court remained the center of elite musical production, a parallel culture of domestic music-making emerged, particularly among the gentry and educated middle class. Lute songs, consort music, and keyboard pieces were performed in private homes, reflecting the diffusion of musical knowledge and taste throughout society. In essence, music during the Tudor period was not merely a decorative art but a dynamic field that mirrored and shaped the complexities of gender, class, education, and intellectual life. Noblewomen used music to navigate courtly expectations and assert cultural influence. Composers and performers from lower social classes found in music a potential, though limited, avenue for social advancement. Institutional education and private instruction created a class of highly trained musicians capable of sustaining the rich musical life of the court. Meanwhile, theoretical writings and compositional treatises codified musical knowledge, helping to create a legacy that extended far beyond the royal household. Together, these developments made music one of the most vibrant and multifaceted expressions of Tudor culture. Whether in the service of devotion, entertainment, or identity, music was a powerful force that transcended boundaries and shaped the experiences of individuals across the social spectrum. During the Tudor period, the evolution of music printing and manuscript culture fundamentally transformed how music was produced, circulated, and preserved. The arrival and expansion of the printing press in England marked a turning point in the dissemination of musical works. Prior to printing, music was largely transmitted through hand-copied manuscripts, which were labor-intensive to produce, vulnerable to errors, and often accessible only to elite institutions such as cathedrals and royal households. The printing press introduced a new level of standardization, making music more widely available to performers and patrons beyond the immediate circles of the court and church. A pivotal moment in this transformation was the royal patent granted in 1575 to two of England's foremost composers, Thomas Tallis and William Byrd. This monopoly on music printing allowed them to regulate the production and distribution of musical works in England. With this privilege, they published significant collections such as the Canciones Sacrae, which not only displayed their own compositional mastery but also set standards for musical notation and publication quality. Their work helped professionalize the music printing industry and facilitated the wider circulation of sacred and secular compositions. Printed music began to reach a growing audience of amateur musicians, particularly among the gentry and educated classes, fostering a culture of domestic music-making that paralleled courtly performance. Despite the advances in printing, manuscript culture remained vibrant, especially within the Tudor court. Manuscripts, often lavishly illuminated and richly decorated, were prized artifacts that symbolized prestige and devotion. Choir books used in the Chapel Royal and other ecclesiastical institutions featured elaborate calligraphy and intricate designs, combining visual artistry with musical content. These choir books were essential for large-scale polyphonic singing, providing multiple vocal parts arranged for ensemble performance. The illumination not only enhanced the aesthetic appeal but also reinforced the sacred and ceremonial significance of the music they contained. Beyond institutional choir books, private households maintained their own collections of manuscripts and music books. These collections reflected the tastes and interests of noble patrons and their families. Household music books contained a mixture of sacred anthems, secular songs, dance music, and instructional material for instruments such as the lute and virginals. As valuable personal possessions, these manuscripts were often passed down through generations or exchanged among members of the court. They served as tangible markers of cultural sophistication and connection to the wider musical life of the period. The Tudor court was also a hub of international musical influences and exchanges. Foreign musicians from Italy, the Low Countries, and Spain frequently served at the English court, bringing with them distinct styles and repertoires that enriched the local musical landscape. Italian musicians introduced innovations in madrigal composition and expressive text setting, while Flemish composers contributed their mastery of intricate polyphony and contrapuntal techniques. Spanish performers and composers, often linked to Queen Mary's marriage to Philip II, brought Iberian elements that influenced sacred and secular music alike. This cultural interplay fostered a dynamic environment where styles were blended and adapted, resulting in a uniquely English synthesis of continental and native traditions. Music also played a role in diplomatic relations, with instruments, manuscripts, and live performances serving as tokens of goodwill and political alliance. Gifts of finely crafted instruments, such as lutes, viols, and virginals, were exchanged between courts, symbolizing cultural prestige and fostering mutual respect. Manuscript collections and printed editions were similarly offered as prestigious presents, reflecting the giver's sophistication and political intent. English musicians often traveled abroad to study or perform, bringing back new ideas and techniques that further enriched the Tudor musical milieu. These international exchanges underscored music's importance as a tool of soft power and cultural diplomacy. The legacy of Tudor music extended well beyond the dynasty itself, influencing the subsequent Jacobean era under James I. Many Tudor court musicians continued their service under James, ensuring continuity in style and repertoire. This period saw the gradual evolution of English musical tastes and practices, incorporating new Baroque elements while maintaining the polyphonic and consort traditions cultivated during the Tudor reign. The foundations laid during the Tudor era shaped the English musical canon, establishing composers like Tallis, Byrd, and Dowland as central figures whose works continued to be performed and admired. In modern times, the music of the Tudor court has experienced significant revival and reinterpretation. Early music ensembles, scholars, and historically informed performers have brought this repertoire back to contemporary audiences, using period instruments and performance techniques to recreate the soundscapes of the past. This revival has deepened understanding of Tudor culture and enhanced appreciation of its artistic achievements. Through research and performance, the enduring influence of Tudor music is recognized not only as a historical artifact but as a living tradition that continues to inspire musicians and listeners today. Overall, the interplay between music printing and manuscript culture, international influences, and the lasting legacy of Tudor music reflects the richness and complexity of the era's soundscape. It highlights the ways in which music was both a product and a driver of cultural exchange, social identity, and artistic innovation, leaving an indelible mark on the course of English musical history. The music of the Tudor court serves as a fascinating lens through which to understand the interplay of art, politics, and society in one of England's most transformative eras. Throughout the period, music was much more than mere entertainment. It was a vital instrument of power, identity, and cultural expression. The court itself functioned as a vibrant nexus where music, authority, and social hierarchy intertwined, reflecting the ambitions and complexities of the Tudor dynasty. One of the dominant themes running through the study of Tudor court music is its close relationship with power. Monarchs like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I not only patronized music lavishly but also used it strategically to reinforce their rule, convey religious and political messages, and craft their public images. Music's ability to communicate subtly yet profoundly, through ritual, ceremony, and symbolic performance, made it a uniquely effective tool of statecraft. The lavish masques, courtly dances, and sacred compositions were carefully designed to project an image of grace, control, and divine favor, bolstering the legitimacy of Tudor monarchs during periods of religious upheaval and political uncertainty. Equally important was music's role as a marker of social status and cultural sophistication. The education of noble women and gentlemen in music underscored its significance as a symbol of refinement and prestige. At the same time, the professionalization of musicians and the inclusion of individuals from varied social backgrounds reveal the subtle ways music could also serve as a vehicle for social mobility and personal advancement. Institutions like the Chapel Royal and choir schools cultivated a class of highly trained musicians who became central figures within court life, illustrating how musical skill was both a cultural asset and a career path. The Tudor court's engagement with international influences, welcoming foreign musicians and embracing continental styles, further enriched the musical landscape, creating a dynamic cultural exchange that reflected England's evolving place in a European political and artistic sphere. The circulation of printed music and richly illuminated manuscripts not only standardized musical practice but also facilitated the dissemination of English compositions beyond the court, embedding Tudor music within a broader, transnational dialogue. Looking beyond the Tudor era, the legacy of this vibrant musical culture continued to shape English music under the Jacobean monarchs and influenced the formation of a distinctive English musical canon. The works of composers such as Tallis, Byrd, and Dowland have endured, celebrated today for their artistic innovation and historical importance. Modern revivals and scholarly research have rekindled interest in this repertoire, allowing contemporary audiences to connect with the cultural heritage of Tudor England. The music of the Tudor court encapsulates a unique convergence of artistic brilliance, political strategy, and social dynamics. It illustrates how music can serve as a powerful medium through which rulers assert authority, societies define identity, and cultures engage with one another. The enduring cultural significance of Tudor court music lies not only in its aesthetic achievements, but also in its capacity to reveal the intricate relationships between sound, power, and grace that continue to resonate across centuries.